Hi everyone, welcome to our episode of the HR Tech Bench. We are here today with the lovely Kelly Carter. Kelly is a seasoned HR leader. She's got over 23 years experience across industries such as mining, infrastructure, oil and gas, construction and aviation. She is currently the General Manager for People and Culture at a very large mining contractor. She's built a remarkable career leading people and culture transformations, shaping high-performing teams and navigating complex mergers and acquisitions across a number of big landscapes. She's got extensive experience in implementing HR technology and optimising people strategies, and she joins us to share her insights on one of the biggest decisions that any organisation needs to make, which is choosing the right HR system. Today we're going to dive into what businesses should consider, what are some of the common pitfalls to avoid, how to align the HR tech stack to your company strategy and your company's unique needs, and ultimately what are some of the lessons that we can all learn in how we go on that journey. So Kelly, thank you so much for joining us. It's really nice to have you here. Really keen, I guess, to spend a little bit of time today just understanding some of your experiences and, some of the exposure that you've had in HR tech systems, the selections that, you've had to make for your businesses and some of the journeys that you've been on and some of the lessons that you've also learnt. Probably the first question I want to start off with is just getting a bit of a sense around how do businesses really look at what the essential features for a HR tech system should be, and what would you advise them in how they kind of go on that journey?
Well, I think my experience has taught me that even more than the technical aspects or the bells and the whistles of the actual systems, I think it's about ensuring that you really understand the critical business processes. So what types of systems automate those things that are really important to that specific business, because different businesses obviously need different things. So I think, and very different functionalities are required depending on where you spend the majority of your time in your business making your money or enabling it. So I think one of the things that I've learnt through many integrations, divestments, purchasing of other businesses and integrating those is the core question is ensuring that it integrates with other systems easily. So it's simple and that it's not too niche.
Yeah.
So that it's something that I think can be supported. So I think, making sure that it will integrate easily, or you end up, as I'm sure you know too, Irene, with different acquisitions or bolt-on kind of ideas. You end up with this hodgepodge of kind of systems, and the HRIS is really central to all of those other systems.
Yeah.
Kind of is the start of everything else.
Yeah.
So
Can you remember a time when you were involved in an implementation where that worked really well, where you were able to really match the right functionality to the right business problems and have it flow through?
To be honest, no. I think the first time, I think probably the most recent implementation that I've been involved in is probably the first time that we've really, through making mistakes previously, really kind of taken a breath and gone back and had a look at what are our information needs and what does our current kind of infrastructure, IT infrastructure, look like? And then I think really asking those questions about the capability of the system to ensure, and being able to see through some of the sales pitch of some of those systems as well. So having the right people in the room. So yes, I think with learnt experience, the last implementation has been the most effective. And obviously technology is moving from where I don't want to show my age, but it's a very different process to go through now than say 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So the systems are much more adaptable, cloud-based. It's an easier question, I think, now.
You raise a really good point around having the right people in the room. I want to ask you you know, what your learnings have been around who are the right people in the room to have, because in my experience, a lot of what I've noticed is that, you know, there's not always the right stakeholders who have been engaged. And as you mentioned earlier, you know, the HRIS system is a lot of times the sort of holder of that master data that then has all of these downstream effects, right, and impacts. So what are those kind of key stakeholders that absolutely must be in the room?
I think it's all your critical business process owners, right? So it's those, not only the decision makers, but it's also those that do the work, that understand in detail how the current transactional business processes actually enable the business. Because often at a exec leader sort of level or a manager level in IT or P&C or wherever, whatever function it happens to be, you're not involved in that detail to understand where some of the problems could arise. So I think definitely a mix of operations, the different functions, the downstream business impacts, as you say, thinking those through.
Yeah.
Thorough business impact assessment and get the right stakeholders in the room, but then pair them up with those that actually understand how those transactions happen and what could be some of the stumbling blocks that you could resolve before implementation. So get the doers in the room, get those real analytical thinkers.
Yeah.
And for not wanting to sound, I think also recognising that what worked 2 years ago may have been surpassed by technology now. So getting those in the room that are at the forefront of using it inside and outside of work.
Yeah.
And I don't want to say younger people, but certainly people that have experience that, you know, that maybe we don't get if we're sitting behind our desks.
Yeah.
Where have you found that it works best, that you have that requirements analysis, that understanding what you're looking for? Who's best to lead the charge there? Have you seen it be successful with a really competent IT department that's guiding the way and doing the business analysis? Is it HR-led? Is it consultants? Like where have you found it worked best in terms of the leadership of that initial analysis?
Look, I think it's a combination of all of those. I think it needs to be internally led and really driven by a change agent, but you can't know everything. So I think whether it's IT or HR led, it's a partnership, and there needs to be a facilitator of that process, which is generally your consultant, to kind of interpret IT speak into business process speak and vice versa. But I think one of the mistakes that businesses make is thinking they can hand it off to a consultant and it will magically happen. It has to be led by those that know the business, how it operates, how it needs to operate, albeit I think the other mistake that I've seen made is businesses insist that their process must be automated. If I think back now, I'm like, let the system tell us how we should do the process.
Yeah. Yeah.
So another key.
Yeah.
Let go of how you always did things.
You also raised another really good point about the change agent side of it. And in my experience, a lot of where these implementations kind of fall apart is that, you know, some of the stakeholders in the room are absolutely engaged in the change. They maybe don't necessarily understand the impact to the day-to-day operations of having this change occur, especially where you are amending elements of the way that you used to do things to the way that you're now going to do things, such as, you know, how you were possibly doing elements of recruitment, or how you were doing elements of, you know, paying people even, and how you were capturing time, etc. And, you know, I find it really interesting that change agent piece seems to be a considerable, I guess, you know, kind of missed opportunity to really support, you know, a successful implementation. What's been your experience with that? And can you maybe give us a couple of examples of a good, you know, maybe change agent sort of process, a good change management process, and maybe one that was not so great?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think I've probably had experiences whereby a business wrongly characterised it as a system change or a system implementation, but it's much broader than that. It's actually about a whole of business change, because you're looking to automate out behaviours that have existed for many years in a business, and it doesn't operate like that. A system is there to automate already embedded behaviours or processes. So that would require little change management. So I think you need to understand your change readiness. You need to understand the gap between how your business currently operates and how it would be required to operate, or how it would operate with this new system. And I guess the capability gap of those individuals within your business, to ensure that once the implementation, or throughout the implementation, and then once it's actually in place, that they actually have the capability to understand not only the process and operating within the system, which is generally pretty easy because the systems now are very intuitive and very simple to use, but it's more about the why behind that. What benefit does it provide to them and to the business to operate in a different way, if that makes sense? So I guess good examples of change management there's probably a very set process. You can use a standard change model and understand where your business is at, understand the business processes that are in place or not in place. I think it's about engaging and enrolling people in the why do we need to do this. I think it's being very honest about change readiness and what is the change story? What, is there don't change for change's sake, to be the cutting edge of technology, but what does it actually do for the business? What does it do for the people? And be able to actually tell that story really clearly. I think the other thing is, don't try and implement a system in the middle of a rapidly changing business that's just acquired another business. So I think, don't be afraid to take a step back, a deep breath, and to pause a project when you need to reevaluate the future needs of the business or the way the business needs to operate. When you were in the middle of a project and the system will no longer, albeit you haven't even got to implementation yet, will no longer meet the needs of that new looking business. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Don't go down a path simply to go down a path.
Yeah, because you've signed up to the path.
Exactly.
Yeah, take a step back and reassess.
Could you tell us a little bit, because obviously you've got a story there about a business that's tried to implement a system, and sometimes you'll do it thinking that's what's going to fix and bring these things together and cement it. But how much business change is too much business change to handle a system implementation? Because nothing's ever static, is it, right? You're always going to have to actually roll with it. How do you get a gauge, and what made it too much in the circumstance that you're thinking of?
Look, I don't think, in my view, I don't think anything's ever too much. We were in the middle of implementing a HIRS in one business, and probably in the early stages of starting to, get the workbooks ready. So we'd already done the needs analysis, we'd picked a system, we were well down the path, and acquired another business that operated in a very different manner, had very different systems. And I think it wasn't about too much change. It was about failing to stop and to reevaluate the project map, the roadmap, and to understand that we had to wind it back to the beginning and start from
Check out the needs
current
still the
reality,
same. Yeah.
needs analysis, business impact assessment, rather than pushing on a path that suited one side of the business but did not necessarily fit the new business. We didn't know what the new business looked like.
Yeah.
So how could we actually understand the system needs of the new business when we didn't understand the processes? We didn't have a handle on just the fundamentals of that business and what was necessary to automate and enable it. So I don't think too much, it's not about what's too much and when is the stop-go point. It's about actually thinking that through.
Yep.
Rather
That
than
makes
just
a lot of
pushing on,
sense.
I will bolt that other business on.
Just from a experiential point of view, have you found that, because you've come from a lot of different industries and, you've spent quite a bit of, time in some different sort of backgrounds, but have you found that, there are industry-specific requirements that maybe look different for one industry that are important to consider when you are doing that system selection versus other industries? What other sort of, advice or, information or lessons have you got for, how you kind of look at some of that needs assessment and analysis, especially for certain industries that are pretty dominant in Australia, really?
Yeah, look, I think obviously there's some complexity in industries such as, port services or aviation around fatigue management and rostering. And so I think the core of a HRIS system is pretty standard. And I think no one system that I've found meets the needs of even one business, let alone every business. Does that? So I think it's about prioritising what is the most important aspect or functionality of that system and matching that to what is the most time consuming and the biggest rock to sort of solve in your business. And again, it comes back to that ability to integrate other systems, such as a really sophisticated rostering system, or when we look at not only the HRIS system, but also the data that needs to be fed to some of the, the operational systems, which are becoming highly automated now, driving trucks from a central, operations control centre in Perth, in the Pilbara, or, the central control systems for process plant technology, and the integrations and the understanding of the impacts of a new HRIS on those systems becomes critical because it can be a safety issue. So I think it's really understanding the integrations, the impacts, and what's your kind of not negotiables, if that makes sense, more than trying to pick a system that's going to do everything, because you just won't find it. I find a lot of organisations that I've worked for, I probably didn't get to pick the system. It was already there. They paid for it. They just hadn't used it for many years. And by the time they get around to using it, it's probably dated and very expensive and probably not the most suitable. But companies buy systems thinking it's going to solve their problems and then have to take a step back and understand their business, map their processes, work out how to implement this beast that they've bought. So I think that's been a common story as well.
Have you been a part of many processes where you felt that not only did your needs assessment adequately look at the problems you were trying to solve, the operations, the logistics of the business, but actually adequately mapped to the strategy of the business? Because so many of the things that you actually talk about, I go, well, all those things fix if you take strategy as primary, right? We can't touch these things because this is our bedrock. This is what we have to do.
Yes.
Do you find that's often taken into consideration, or that maybe where you go wrong sometimes is by looking at the rats and mice rather than the big picture?
Yeah, I think that's the experience I was talking about in terms of the whole, not only the structure, but the whole strategy of the business had changed. So therefore, that's where we got into trouble in terms of not reevaluating, was this aligned to that strategy? So I keep talking about business processes. I think it's important to understand those, but a lot of systems now come out with a standard suite of business processes and you can just follow those. But it's about understanding, exactly as you said, what is the strategy for the business? Are we going to grow? How adaptable is, how scalable is this system going to be for us? What does it enable in terms of culture? You know, so does it empower your people? Does it create more control and governance, which in an operational aviation type environment, you might be looking for more control and governance, whereas in a, you know, a more creative or a services white collar business, you're looking to empower and to free people to work differently. Does that
Yeah,
make
no,
sense?
that's,
So I
that,
think
that's it.
it's
A
not only
startup,
about
for
the strategy,
instance,
but
that's
it's about alignment to culture as
Yep.
well. And as I said, systems are not bespoke to every single business strategy or culture, but it's about understanding where the gaps may be between your strategy and your culture and the systems available to you, and how do you tell the story around that,
Yeah.
and how do you cover those gaps, I think is the important thing.
Yeah. Yeah. In your experience, and maybe you haven't had the experience yet, and maybe you will at some point, hopefully, but what do you think success actually looks like of a good HR system implementation?
I'm hoping this latest one will be a success story. Look, I think they've all had various levels of success and they all add something to the business. And you see the success, you know, after sort of 12 months of people getting used to it and suddenly it's business as usual. But success to me would be early adoption of the system. I think providing that information that drives different decisions in the business, or maybe the same decisions, but it's providing valuable insights that previously may have been very hard and time consuming to get at the push of a button, so to speak. Success would be on time, on budget.
Yeah.
And not too many, I guess, surprises as part of that implementation. So, you know, the system not doing what it needs to do or having an impact on a downstream, as I said, system that that stops the business in some way or creates some safety concern. And I think also the sustainability of the system. So if you get 5 years out of it, success, because they're just changing so rapidly. So it's value for money, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think also you touched on a really good point there about, you know, the sustainability and the future proofing almost of going through this really, you know, significant implementation, you know, most of which take at least a year to 2 years to, you know, to kind of, I guess, get, you know, from the start of the inception of we're a business that now needs to, you know, really rethink our HR tech stack all the way through to, you know, finally we're onboarded and we're ready to go. So it's a significant investment, and to then not have it sustainable for at least 5 to 7, maybe even 10 years, you know, if you can get that out of it, feels like almost an investment that maybe is, you know, is not the most thought through, right? And if you think about, you know, businesses and operational budgets, etc., then, you know, maybe there are elements of that story that don't stack up. So I think the sustainability piece is also important.
And I also think about that in 2 ways. So, you know, some of the system implementations that I've been involved in the past, I think they're shifting quite quickly, and I'm probably not the best person to be speaking about this. If you spoke to my daughter or some of my younger team members, they would know a lot more than I. I am, you know, I am certainly learning from them, but they used to be beasts, right? 12 months, 18 months.
Yeah.
For one aspect of that system, and then you had stage 2 and 3 and 4. I think it's either that sustainability of that sort of, you know, that central system that does all of your business processes and branches out to finance and everything else, or it's small modularised kind of implementations that enable your business, but that can easily be changed or adapted. You know, so kind of that almost invisible change where there's not this big bang and
Yeah.
People are completely consumed by this project,
Yeah.
which I've seen happen, and they lose sight of the business as usual. But almost, I think success to me looks like it just kind of evolves and trickles through, and people don't really even realise
Yeah.
that things have just suddenly gotten better. Does that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I don't necessarily think that big bang beast of a project is necessary in businesses these days. Everything is so modularised, and we can do it step by step.
Yeah, and almost building block and stacking rather than going for the big bang.
Provided you have a very clear understanding of your current reality and your future needs and what the infrastructure looks like today, and that it's got, when you do that in small chunks, that it's all integrated and there's a clear map, there's a drawing that says, here's how we're going to, this is all
Yeah.
going to come together
Yeah.
at a point in time. Just
Yeah, here's how all
not
the
an ad hoc
information.
approach to
No.
we'll bolt
Yeah.
this system on and bolt that system on.
Which
That's
is
certainly not what I meant.
unfortunately how I think some
Yeah.
of the inherent systems have tended to exist, right? But you're absolutely right. Where I see, certainly in my experience, the some of this stuff moving to is very much much greater focus on that integration piece, and also how are all the different modules going to actually complement each other? How's the data going to flow through each one of those modules and each one of those components of the HR tech stack? And how are each of those components then going to be able to provide the downstream and upstream data that is needed for a business to make some really smart, informed decisions as well?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you best go about measuring the business value that a HR implementation can generate? Because a lot of the what does good look like you talked about was a successful project of we had to have an HR system, now we have an HR system and it didn't cause too much trouble. But in terms of did we decrease costs, did we increase revenue, did we decrease risk, what does good look like in that space? And have you been able to be a part of something where you were able to actually demonstrate that successfully?
I think that's a really good question, because I think a lot of time when we look at these projects, there's a lot of capital invested in automation, not only of HRIS systems, but operational kind of systems at the moment. We've got AI and we've got automation and got robots out there working on some of the sites. I'm no longer in those organisations and I missed all of that. But I think key is, again, getting back to what is the goal of that project and actually being realistic about the cost and benefits. So I think success post-implementation is you free up people to do more value-adding work, particularly I'll limit it to just HRIS. So for me, success looks like I've got less people doing routine transactional administration type work, which demotivates, really burns people out, versus having them working in the sort of looking forward proactive space. So they're actually able to enrol and engage people and get them giving discretionary effort. And that starts to obviously de-risk the business because we're not missing things. We're getting reminders, we're ensuring that we're capturing information that helps us to govern the business better. So I think, yes, it's de-risking, it's better governance. I think there's more information to support where we prioritise, because every business has finite resources. So where do we spend our time? Where are those biggest opportunities? And the data tells us that more clearly and challenges what we may think we know or what we think the problem or the opportunity is. I think there's some just real baseline kind of analysis to be done about the people that it would take to operate or to ensure that that system maintains its data integrity, is administered well, versus the number of people that you would no longer require in your business doing a lot of work that's not really adding a lot of value but costing a lot of money. So you do see decreases sometimes in employees. But I would caution that you need to understand whether there will be that cost saving in terms of headcount, as a for want of a better term, but in terms of people, because I think what people do changes, but you don't necessarily need less people, is my experience with the HRIS at least. Other automation might be different.
Do you find that's often an area you get pushed to when trying to actually get the capital, right? Because that's something that CEOs and boards and, you know, other exec are always going to want to hear is, well, where does this hit the bottom line? Where can I, you know, reduce the numbers? Does that create a problem sometimes in how you scope these projects, you know, where you assess the needs analysis and put the emphasis?
I think in the past I would say definitely. And, you know, the capital, kind of the case put forward to secure the capital funding, particularly for big global projects, which I've only sort of seen two, I guess, was definitely about what it was going to save in terms of people costs and rework, that type of thing. I do see the business cases kind of changing as businesses are learning. So it's not solely based on just what we'll save in you know, the salary costs, but it's leaning more towards, I guess, the opportunity cost of not doing it, and the fact that it's almost a non-negotiable for growth of a business, because if you don't have those core systems in place, which I've seen at one business recently, everything was paper-based, relied on knowledge in people's head. They didn't have appropriate systems in place to make things easy, and when they tried to grow quite rapidly, it became hugely problematic. But yet it wasn't when, you know, they were just in business as usual kind of state. So I think it's less about justifying the investment and more about understanding it has to happen if they want to grow or they want to survive, you know, in the current market. So it's definitely changed, I think. The expectations of my leaders certainly has changed.
Probably brings you back to that link to strategy, right? If we actually understand how our HR system enables strategy,
Correct.
right, then we can start to make the decisions about where this sits in terms of priorities. Is because, well, if we don't have this, we can't make these decisions. We can't take care of these potential strategic pitfalls, these things that we're trying to avoid, or we can't maintain our competitive advantage. So-
Correct. Yeah. Particularly for contracting businesses, there, you know, certain expectations of delivering information to principals or to external regulators now. It's, you know, HR information systems have almost become a necessity to meet the obligations of the external regulators and of, you know, clients. So
There is actually a piece now starting to really become, I think, you know, if we think back 10 years ago, HR systems definitely had an element of compliance associated to them, but it's certainly something that I'm experiencing much more vividly in, you know, in some of the conversations that I'm having. Is that compliance piece has actually almost become a lever or a driver for why, you know, a HR stack needs to be relooked at. Can you maybe just share any experiences that you've had in that space, and you know, I guess what sort of advice or what you know, what sort of, I guess, baseline things would be important for a business to make sure that they are considering in that compliance space, and, you know, certainly specific to HR systems and or, you know, payroll systems, etc.
yeah, again, it's about knowing your business, because if you're in a, you know, a public company versus a private, and if it's American listed and you've got to comply with, you know, SOX, so you need to understand your business, and then you need to understand what those external legislative kind of compliance requirements are, and what potentially they could look like in the future, depending on what happens in the political space. So I think And a lot of it is about just, so it's not that you can't do it, it's the same with growth. It's not that you can't do it, it's just really, really difficult. And you generally have a likelihood of failure, which then impacts your ability to grow and to win new business or to maintain credibility with whoever your external stakeholders are. So I think understand what it is that you need to report on, that you need to be on top of, to ensure that you're complying. So have your list of external regulations and how they impact your business and what could be potentially coming in the future. And then, so not only overlaying it with your business process needs, but also with the external requirements, and just understanding how that system could help you to flag where you've got risks, to be able to, produce, capturing the data to produce the reports that help you to prove compliance as well as. So there's kind of two aspects: helping with the governance and ensuring compliance, but then also capturing the data to prove compliance, so that you don't have to go through a bunch of paper records or sit in some sort of external regulator's office to explain that,
God forbid,
we've done it, but we just can't.
We can't prove
we can't prove it because we can't find the data. So I think it's just another layer now that organisations are looking for that probably they didn't previously. They really just, well, maybe they did, and I'm just way behind the eight ball. But I think it's become so time consuming now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's more of a priority. It's just pushed its way up the list for system kind of.
Yeah. And I think some of the recent legislative changes in Australia have meant that, it's become critical, mission critical now, to be able to actually manage this type of information in ways that are compliant, produce this type of information in ways that are compliant, and ensure that basically your baseline is absolute compliance, especially with, pay components,
absolutely.
etc.
The requirement to ensure, that in any given year, even with an EA in place, that you can still pass, a better off overall test against any award that may apply to your workforce. I think the casual conversion regime, I think there's just so many, and it happened so fast. I went away for a couple of years, came back, and I was like, whoa, the whole landscape has changed, and it's incredibly complex to work through and understand, the compliance requirements for employers. So, it's really complex.
I have I guess we touched earlier on the sort of cost component of some of these projects. One of the things that I'm experiencing is that, some of the organisations that I've worked in internally and also externally, have really underestimated some of the cost component of some of these implementations, even if they are looking at doing them in a modular fashion where they're stacking them rather than just, big banging them. What's been your experience in how you actually cost this stuff up, and what are the key kind of critical components to remember?
I think so obviously there's a system itself, and really weighing up how you use that system. So what is the best cost structure to set up? Because obviously you have some which are, based on the per user, or, then you have others that are an annual kind of fee, and then you have others that might be a one-off purchase. So really understanding how you will utilise that system and what's the most cost-effective kind of proposal from those providers. Or at least because cost is not always the main factor of choosing a system, obviously, but it's about understanding what will that look like, again, aligned to your strategy, particularly if you're expecting to experience significant growth, and understanding what the future costs of that system may be. So I think not just looking at it based on today, but really mapping out different scenarios for how that system will cost you going forward. I think then looking at the resourcing costs, both internally and externally. So a lot of, I guess, contingency in that proposal, in that capital kind of request, because often it takes longer than maybe what you expect. So I think, budgeting for longer support periods from the consultants, ensuring that internal resources are costed, because you will need to backfill roles if you want to do it properly. This whole doing it as part of your day job, I have found in my experience, it's ineffective, and
Yes.
it ends up costing a lot more than just biting the bullet and assigning people to be those project leads per function and focusing and championing that change and that implementation. It might seem like it costs up front, but it's well worth the investment and saves you a lot of money during and on the back end of an implementation.
Yeah.
Apart from that, I think they're the two key things that I've
Yeah.
learnt, to be honest. To be fair, I think a lot of the time the budget, the cost falls on IT to actually explain to the business. So I haven't had as much exposure to that as what I probably could have,
Yeah.
thank goodness,
Yeah.
because it always blew out. Wasn't me.
I think it is definitely, in my experience, one of the harder components for a business to assess is, how long is this process going to take? Certainly the resourcing side of it has typically been, undercooked in most implementations, both internal, external, that I've supported. I think businesses really struggle to understand the extent of the heavy lifting that's required from internal resources and from the business themselves and operational leads and all of the other stakeholders that are required to be involved to ensure a successful implementation, and one that does actually output some really good results for the business. And so that cost factor consistently and the resourcing factor consistently does actually come up. And I do see it quite a lot, and I really, I think that there are some lessons in there around some of those kind of common pitfalls in how you move through that selection process and how you move through that analysis process and how you do engage all of those key stakeholders. And just on the key stakeholders, probably the one other thing that I did want to just quickly touch on is just the financial side of it. And obviously you don't come from finance, and we will have an episode focusing specifically on that piece. But in your experience, how critical has the engagement of some of those kind of downstream organisations and organisational components been in these kind of projects?
Absolutely critical, and I think critical up front to give that sort of experiential learning, because I think that's a lot of the reason why it goes off the rails, is because people are not aware of the impacts, particularly on the finances of tracking the finances of the business or the finance systems. They're not aware of the resources required and the impacts on not only the costs of the implementation, but also the opportunity cost to the business if it does run over.
Yeah.
So I think getting that up front and kind of playing out scenarios about how this could go versus how it will go if there's no commitment and drive to stick to those timelines. A lot of these projects kind of float because there's not the commitment from that leadership team to giving it the resources and the time and the energy that's required to get these things across the line. So it's kind of like their second or third priority because there's a project lead from HR or IT or a consultant to do it for them. But yeah, it's obviously key. People are the biggest cost in the majority of businesses, and that's the master data that drives the costing of where your people are and which client are we charging, and which helicopter are they in, and what's the charge out rate for that. Yeah, it's absolutely critical to understand what we're doing and how it's going to impact those other processes or systems or stakeholders.
Yeah. I think the interesting piece for me weaving through all of this is that while it is a HR system, it ultimately touches so many other elements of the business, operationally, financially, supports the decision-making process in so much of how you actually end up running the business, because, 9 times out of 10, typically labour is one of the biggest costs, and therefore it has, you know, these consistent sort of, you know, outreaching kind of variances.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's the kind of it's the starting point, it's the ground zero for all of the other systems, right? Person comes in, they get put on the HRIS system, and then they get their operational license, you know, to go and operate those systems, and they get put in the finance. So it's kind of like the starting point
Yeah.
that feeds that critical information to every other system. So
Yeah.
hugely important.
Perfect. Final sort of, you know, takeaways or final lessons or final key insights that you might have for people who are about to embark on this journey, have either gone through this journey before, or, you know, have had really not a great deal of experience, especially, you know, as in a role as senior as the, you know, general manager of HR, which you're in. What would sort of be your advice for anyone sitting in some of those key stakeholder roles? What are the sort of final, I guess, kind of takeaways for you?
Look, I'm not a technical person, as you know, and I would never have thought that I could understand or be involved in, you know, a system implementation or understanding how a system works or IT infrastructure. And it's actually not about that. I think it's about understanding the strategy of the business. It's about understanding how we need to enable those critical business processes that help us deliver that strategy. So I think my takeaway is that it needs to be a partnership between those subject matter experts. I mean, this is not new. And also those that are real systems thinkers that understand the business processes, and one can't do it without the other. So if you don't feel that you have any credibility in terms of even being able to answer your mobile phone, as I didn't, probably still don't, you're just as necessary in these roles as your IT or systems experts. It has to be that partnership. So get involved, make sure you ask questions, you seek to understand, and if something doesn't kind of look or feel right, continue to ask questions, I think.
Yeah.
But also, but listen to the advice, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Really, you know, I guess loved your just openness and honesty on, you know, some of the stuff that we covered. Things like making sure that we have all the right stakeholders in place, making sure that we've thought about things like how systems integrate with each other, what are the downflow effects into other systems, making sure that we've got the right change agents and the right change attitude while yes, it is a system implementation, making sure that the business is on board. We've understood the strategy, we've understood what it is that we're really, you know, are trying to achieve as a business in the next sort of, you know, 5 to 10 years. Where are we going to be, and making sure that everything aligns. So really appreciate that. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please just jump on board to the HR Tech Bench podcast. We would love to hear from you. If there's any particular questions that you have, if there's any particular subjects that you'd like us to cover, then please send us an email at info@thehrtechbench.com. See you next week.